Well, I've been really interested to get your reaction, Gavin, to this Telegraph reporting. We're big fans of movies over here at the Vanguard. And I feel like from now until Christmas, the whole world is kind of big fans of movies. This is the prime time to go to the movies. It's cold outside, it's the holidays. People are excited. And I was not expecting to get this news this morning when I woke up. Is this your new James Bond? Rising star Callum Turner is strongly rumored to succeed Daniel Craig as the next 007. I've already been paying close attention to this Bond adaptation because it's going to be directed by Denis Villeneuve, a director that Gavin and I have loved for a really long time. And it's also written by the gentleman that wrote the show Peaky Blinders, which I was a pretty big fan of, at least for the first few seasons. I did not realize Callum Turner had developed into the kind of star that would be considered for James Bond, Gavin. However, I guess it wasn't like Daniel Craig was the star he is today when he was cast in Casino Royale. To my recollection, the only film I've seen this gentleman in is the 2015 Jeremy Saulnier punk rock movie Green Room, which I absolutely adored.
Did he play one of the band members in that?
Yeah, he was the drummer. He has like a punk rock haircut in it. And he's not even the protagonist at all, but he's one of the band members.
Gotcha. Because I've also seen Green Room, obviously, a couple of times, but I don't specifically remember this guy's performance in the film or anything. So, admittedly, I'm not super familiar with his work. I guess my first reaction was one of slight being a little bit underwhelmed. I guess I'm just like, okay. I mean, he looks like he could be Bond. I'm gonna have to see more, before I really believe that he's capable of filling those shoes. But I mean, there's no reason to believe he would fail or anything like that. It is interesting. I was reading this on World of Real. Apparently, the betting odds changed just overnight. It says something happened with the bookies overnight in the last 48 hours, maybe based on insider intel, maybe not. They've catapulted a new actor to the top of their odds for who will play 007 in Denis Villeneuve's upcoming Bond film. Apparently, Callum Turner is the red hot favorite to step into the shoes previously worn by Daniel Craig. He's now ahead of Jacob Elordi, Aaron Taylor-Johnson, Anthony Boyle, etc., because odds move when large bets come in, which is the case with Turner's rise to the top. Many interpret that as a sign that insiders or people close to the project are betting, which fuels more speculation, which is kind of an interesting aspect of this. People close to the situation, insiders, they're I guess, profiting off of their inside knowledge. They're like, yeah, we know this guy's going to be Bond. Let's make some money on that shit. Let's, get our bets in while we can before anyone else figures it out, which is pretty interesting. Who knows if this actually turns out to be true, obviously. But ultimately, Zach, I'm more excited about the fact that Denis Villeneuve is doing this project. The actor to me is a little bit irrelevant. I think really any strong actor that looks the part and is British. I think this guy's British. That's a big thing to me. I think the guy definitely needs to be British, or at least from the UK. But other than that, I'm mostly just excited about Denis Villeneuve doing this because he's such a strong director. And even though I'm a huge fan of the Bond series, it is pretty rare that a really interesting, strong directorial voice, a kind of auteur filmmaker, takes over a Bond movie. Usually the directors they hire are kind of just directors without a super memorable style, even Sam Mendes, who did Skyfall. It's not like he's really
They're company men.
Yeah, they're kind of company men. That's a great way to put it, which is often works out. I mean, Martin Campbell obviously famously directed not only Casino Royale, but also GoldenEye, launching not only the Bond franchise of Daniel Craig, but also Pierce Brosnan very successfully. So, I mean, you can definitely knock it out of the park, but I am interested to see someone like Denis Villeneuve, who's obviously not, Christopher Nolan or Quentin Tarantino, two people that fans have fantasized about creating a Bond movie for a while. But I think he's pretty close to just as exciting.
Yeah, if not more exciting to me than Tarantino. God, I mean, I can't say I would be more excited to have Denis do it than Christopher Nolan doing it, especially after the teasers that we've seen from the Odyssey that's coming out. It looks really awesome. But to me, I consider them to be the titans of blockbuster cinema of our time. I really enjoy everything that I've seen from Denis Villeneuve, going back to his early work and with Enemy and Prisoners, and into his later work with Arrival and Blade Runner 2049, and then of course the Dune movie. So really excited to see what he does. I think the other interesting element of this story that you brought up, Gavin, is the betting market, right? And any other kind of professional setting where you would be investing based off of insider information, we would make that against the law, right? It would be called insider trading. It would be an SEC violation. And if you got caught, you would go to jail. Now, enforcement is pretty lax depending on the situation, but it is technically against the law with these unregulated betting markets. It's not against the law at all. And with Hollywood kind of struggling and not as many jobs on the table, I wouldn't be surprised if more insiders were taking swings and being like, oh, I want to make a little bit of money on the side because I happen to know Jacob Elordi's out, right? You might not know for sure Callum Turner's in, but you did hear specifically Jacob Elordi's out. Oh my gosh, I want to put 100, 500, 2,000 bucks. And maybe I'm a studio executive that hasn't had a hit in a while. And I'm like, oh, I know for sure they're going with Callum Turner. I'll put 100 grand on this on Kalshi, and that'll have a decent return on investment for me because I know it's a sure thing already. Very, very interesting. And then also subsequently, you've got guys like the World of Jordan from World of Real who are kind of using that as a way to gauge legitimacy of news stories and rumors on the block. Pretty interesting stuff. The other thing I wanted to throw out that I think a lot of people in our audience will be interested in is, this new Bond movie is going to be produced by Amazon and MGM. That's another reason I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Gavin, Christopher Nolan couldn't get attached to the project was they weren't going to give him final cut. They weren't going to meet the laundry list of requirements that a guy like Christopher Nolan just fucking demands. And I also know that there is not a snowball's chance in hell that Christopher Nolan would have signed off on Jeff Bezos casting his wife, Lauren Sanchez, in major role in Amazon MGM's new James Bond. This isn't just fantasy casting. Do you think that there's any way Denis going to be able to wiggle his way out of this, or do you think we'll see Lauren Sanchez in the new Bond movie?
I mean, I could definitely see her popping up in a cameo. I don't think she's going to have a major role in this. I mean, I'm sure that someone is reporting this behind the scenes. I think that just goes a little bit too far. I don't think Jeff Bezos is that crazy and stupid that he's literally going to like force his stupid wife or whatever, who seemingly has very little charisma anyway, to be like the main like Bond girl. That just seems like a ridiculous decision from a financial perspective when there's so many leading ladies out there with much bigger profiles that are actual celebrities. Like I heard a report that I found to be more credible that said Bezos was obsessed with getting Sydney Sweeney as the Bond girl in the movie. And that would actually at least make sense. Like she does fit the profile of the kind of leading lady who typically ends up in the role of the Bond girl in any given movie. I mean, going back to the day when Halle Berry was a Bond girl and, all the ones from the Pierce Brosnan era, all that kind of stuff. Right. So I think that at least makes sense. Not that I would cast Sydney Sweeney if I was in charge of the new Bond production, but at least that makes sense. I think that if Jeff Bezos' wife, Lauren Sanchez, ends up in this, it will probably be like in a cameo role or like kind of in the background, something like that. But honestly, Jeff Bezos should be obsessed with casting himself in the new Bond film because, I mean, who would make for a better Bond villain? Jeff Bezos is literally an IRL Bond villain, which does make it even funnier, the fact that he's like bankrolling and, producing this series and is apparently obsessed with James Bond. Apparently he's a real head.
Interesting. Yeah. Also, Lauren Sanchez Bezos is 20 years older than this guy that they're considering for the role. So I think that's, got to be considered as well. I would cast Anya Taylor-Joy. I think she's the perfect Bond girl that hasn't been cast as a Bond girl yet. But anyway, I just thought it would be interesting to get your speculation. If you had your druthers, Gavin, who would you cast to be the next Bond?
Oh God. I haven't thought enough about it, to be honest. There's not one person or one name that I think like stands, head and shoulders above the rest. And much like Daniel Craig, I think that the best Bond could be someone that no one's really expecting, not someone who's a big star. Like even Jacob Elordi does seem like a little bit too big of a star at this point. I think they should go with someone who's a little bit more unknown than a guy like Jacob Elordi, even as someone who really does like Jacob Elordi. I think he's a really talented actor. I just don't necessarily see him in that role. But I am a huge Bond fan of basically every iteration of the franchise. Obviously, all the Sean Connery ones are great. I also have a real soft spot for some of the Roger Moore movies. They just have such rich, like, kind of often corny, but still just really lush late 60s and 70s atmosphere. Like the movie Live and Let Die, obviously, which has the Paul McCartney song as the title track. That's such a fun movie from that era. It's definitely dated in a few parts. There's some stuff that might not fly today in the movies, but you just watch that film and it's so rich with the practical sets and these lush backdrops, and like there's real alligators swimming in the moat, and he has to walk over them, and they actually had the actor step on real alligators across the pond. Like there's just so much great stuff in those films. And it's great that you can watch the cheesier, more fun Roger Moore ones if you're in the mood for that campy vibe. And then if you want, you can also turn on one of the darker Timothy Dalton movies, which are a little bit more faithful to the Fleming books, or obviously the Daniel Craig films, the first of which, Casino Royale, might be my personal favorite James Bond movie, maybe just because of the nostalgia. But still, it's a great series. And even though it is now unfortunately owned by Amazon, I am optimistic about this because of Denis Villeneuve's involvement. That's a pretty big feather in the cap of this upcoming series.
Yeah, and I think the testament to those Daniel Craig performances, and I completely agree. I think as a piece of cinema, a complete film, Casino Royale is the best Bond movie that I've ever seen. I haven't seen them all, but I think a testament to that is my initial reaction was, isn't it a little bit too soon to recast Bond? Because to everybody of our generation, James Bond is Daniel Craig, but Daniel Craig's actually had the longest span as James Bond out of any other actor. It was 2004 when he was officially cast as James Bond, Casino Royale coming out in 2005 or 2006. And that's pretty crazy to think about, that a 20-year run in between Bonds, completely defining it. So I am excited to see a new spin on it. I think Denis will do a great job. And I also don't have anybody that like runs to the top of my head. I remember for a long time the popular choice was Idris Elba. I would have loved to see that, but I think he's just too old now, and that's why they had to move on, because I think he's already Daniel Craig's age, and you can't just start with the same problems you had with Daniel Craig at the end.
Yeah, that is unfortunate because he would have been a great Bond. I agree. Unfortunately, the window has passed for Mr. Idris Elba. The one kind of debate going on, and we'll move on to real politics in a second, guys. Bear with us. But the one debate that I'm kind of interested in your opinion on, that I'm a little bit conflicted on too, is like whether or not they should set this Bond film in the past or in the present. Because reportedly Nolan's idea was to like do a direct adaptation of one of the original Ian Fleming novels, even potentially Casino Royale, which is the first ever James Bond book ever published by Ian Fleming. And reportedly Nolan wanted to do like a period piece Bond movie set in the 50s or 60s or something like that. But the studio, they wanted to keep it modern. They wanted to set it in the present day, much like every other iteration of the series. The Bond films have always taken place the year that they are released in. Like they always take place and reflect the era in which they're made. But people are still reporting that even with Denis Villeneuve on the project now instead of Nolan, that he's also interested in going back in time and like making a Bond film set in the 50s or the 60s, kind of telling the story of James Bond's origin, how he came up through MI6 and all that kind of mythology and lore. So do you think that's a good idea to go back into the 50s or 60s and make kind of a retro style period piece Bond? Or do you think that much like every other iteration of the franchise, it should take place in the modern era and reflect the zeitgeist in which it is created?
So that's a really good question. I could be swayed either way depending on the idea that was presented to me. But while I'm looking at Callum Turner, he has the qualities and he has the look of a guy that I think would really succeed in a period piece Bond, right? You mentioned the other day, Josh O'Connor doesn't look like a guy that was just scrolling on his iPhone before he comes to set. This guy, Callum Turner, has a similar look to him where he could play a guy from the 1950s or 60s in England, somebody who was raised to be proper, somebody who had traditional English parent, a guy that I could see drinking a martini. So to be honest, I could go either way. But because I love the richness of the 50s and 60s, I think it's a more cinematic time period. I wouldn't be opposed to seeing them change it up a little bit and say, you know what, we're actually going back in time for this one. We're going to set it in the 1950s. It hasn't been done really well in a while. Obviously, you'd have to go back to the, what's his fuck Sean Connery guy to get the true 60s vibe from Bond, because Pierce Brosnan was a very 90s, tech gadgety kind of a Bond.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they should actually set it in the past. I think it would be a much needed kind of, new take on the series. And the reason I mostly say that is because what I really don't want this film to feel like, and what I think some of the other non-Casino Royale Daniel Craig movies felt a little bit too much like, was just another spy movie. Mission Impossible, Jason Bourne. There's all these kind of like Bond knockoffs. And they all do take place in the present day. Like the last Mission Impossible movie with Tom Cruise, it was like tackling AI and like dealing with all these like modern threats that he might have to face. And I just don't really care to see Bond face off against like AI and, all of these super hyper modern issues. To me, Bond is very much a series, that comes out of that older era, the old world. There's a lot of aspects about James Bond as a character, that you can tell that about. For example, his attitude towards women. Um, so there's certain things like that where I just think Bond doesn't work as well in the modern era. And some of the Daniel Craig movies that almost felt like they were constantly like apologizing for Bond and who he was and like trying to make up for it by adding all these jabs in, and like it just felt like it was like almost ashamed of itself at a certain point. Not Casino Royale, but some of the ones that came after that. And I do think that just returning back to like the 50s or 60s would give the Bond series more permission to just feel like those classic Bond movies. And again, just from a visual perspective, I think it'd be great with some awesome production design and some retro flair to really, especially if you're going to go back to like Casino Royale and stuff. I'd love to see those like 1950s, 60s style casinos,
Imagine what
Monaco.
Monte Carlo looked like.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Vegas, like all of that stuff would be so cool to see with a little bit of a vintage filter, a little bit of a retro production design. Think about the fashion. I mean, there's so many opportunities just on that level, regardless of the narrative or the actor or anything like that. Just from a production design and a costume direction, it would be awesome, I think, to go back in time. And again, it would avoid the feeling of, oh, this is just another movie like Mission Impossible or Bourne or John Wick or all these other kind of movies out there that sort of scratch a similar itch that the Bond series has.
Completely agree. I think if you are going to keep it in the modern era, you need to spin it, right? So that it doesn't just become a tired spy movie. And I think it needs to be like, okay, this is James Bond as he's arriving at the end of the era, right? This is the end of the spy era. This is the end of the, dapper, well dressed gentleman sleuth who could also kick your ass and kill you. And I think that it would have to kind of lean into that, dare I say, Sopranos element of what's it like to rise to the top right as everything is wrapping up, and exploring, American and British societies and how they've changed and devolved, and how there isn't the same care and craftsmanship and all these. It would have to be very meta, I think, if they were going to do it successfully. There is a way, I think, to modernize Bond and address all of those issues, but I think a better, more fun experience at the movies is just setting it in the 50s.
Yeah, that's what I would want them to do also. I mean, without going over the top, I don't want them to do like nostalgia porn, Stranger Things style, like,
Oh, sure.
this like fake, shitty looking version of the 50s. I'd want it to be well done. But I trust Denis Villeneuve to pull that off. And one of the best things about the Dune movies is the visuals in them, the production design, the cinematography by Greg Fraser. It's all just immaculate, literally immaculate. So again, outside of Nolan, I think Villeneuve is about as best as you can do
Yep.
for this series right now. And I think he can really deliver as long as Bezos doesn't meddle too much, as long as Bezos isn't forcing stupid ideas, down his throat, like casting his dumb wife or whatever. I think we could be looking at something real special. And luckily, also, unlike Netflix, even though this is like a movie produced by Amazon, Amazon usually does give their big movies like this an actual theatrical release. They're not just trying to force everyone onto their dumb streaming service and like kill the theater industry in the process. So at least we can actually look forward to seeing this on like a proper, big screen, full release, IMAX, all that jazz.